You just heard, the readings invite us to reflect on what faith is, considering it's such a basic basis of our spiritual life. It might be good to have some, well, not just clear, but profound ideas. Profound ideas aren't always clear. So it is a mystery in any case. But what's fascinating right away from this first reading from Habakkuk, of all people, is this very obscure, seemingly obscure last verse where it says, "The just one by his faith shall live." Now, Paul, being a rabbi, knew his scriptures, and he actually took that one tiny hidden verse and made it the basis of his whole theology. His whole letter to the Romans about faith, and then in the Galatians and other letters, his whole theology is that it's by faith that we're saved, by surrender to Jesus, by the grace of God, by the gift of God, and not by any works of the law or that we could perform on our own. That's his whole theology, based on his own experience, that he followed the law perfectly and was a murderer, and then he received God's grace as a grace, and the surrender of faith came. So at the very beginning, the first chapter of the letter to the Romans, he quotes this verse and then develops his theology on the basis of that. So what is faith? Well, if we look at Paul himself, we can see that it's a total surrender of yourself, a gift of your whole being in response to God's total gift of himself to you. So it's a grace, it's a gift, as we've always said, as Paul clearly experienced, comes from God, and then it evokes the similar response to that gift, the total gift of ourself in return. That's what faith is. It's the surrender. It's the, what they call the leap of faith. We leap into the arms of God, into the mercy of God, into the mystery of God. That's how we should see faith. Now, in our own tradition, we've sometimes kind of narrowed it down for various reasons. One of them being, the Protestant Reformation, where the claim was that faith was more than fiducial faith, meaning trust. It was actually a gift in mind, the intellect mainly. The irony being that that's not the kind of faith Jesus asked for in the gospel, is it? He didn't say to the people clamoring for his healing, do you believe that I'm the Son of God, the second person of the blessed Trinity? No, he just said, do you trust me? Do you believe that I can do this? It's trust, it's surrender. The irony also being that the word that is in Hebrew there in that verse, emunah, means faithfulness. Something that's solid and dependable. First of all, as I've just explained, God's faithfulness to us in giving God's self to us. But then also our faithfulness, our consistency in giving ourselves to God. That's the whole cycle of faith. So if you center it too much in the mind, there are a number of regrettable consequences. First of all, that you lose that kind of energy, that kind of fullness. Another consequence is that you confuse the creed or the list of beliefs with the act of faith. Now, the beliefs come from the faith. They're elaborated on the basis of the experience of faith, but they're not faith. They're beliefs. Faith and beliefs are not the same thing. Faith is what saves. Belief is how it's articulated. So faith is not a list of beliefs. Do you believe this? No. Do you surrender to the Lord? The rest follows. Surrender of the mind, etc. The other thing is that we've gotten this distinction in theology over the centuries where you can have dead faith and living faith. A dead faith is like the demon's faith. They believe that God exists, but it's all, just a belief and there's no life to it. Living faith is when you have love In other words, when your whole being is involved. So you love God, you not just believe that God exists, but you love the God in whom you believe. So what good, indeed, is this dead faith, as the scriptures themselves say, unless it's a living faith? So it's much better to see this, this fullness, this inner radiance. It's a light, of course, it is a light, but not just to our mind. Our whole being is radiant with this life and light of God. And that's what faith is. Now, the other thing is, if it is really alive, then like all living things, it grows. It needs to grow. There's a phrase in the second reading today, a word that parathiki, which means deposit, the deposit of faith. You've probably heard that expression. It's translated here as the rich trust that's been given to you. Because so it's something that is confided to us, it's given to us, but if it's too much of a deposit, like you kind of, like maybe bury in the ground, like that parable, it seems like it's something inert or lifeless or unchanging. But not if it's something living. Faith needs to grow, to expand, to deepen, to enter in as we leap into that eternal, infinite mystery of God. Of course, it's vast new perspectives are going to open up by the very dynamic and organic, thrust of faith itself. Into whole new perspectives and maybe whole new formulas, But we kind of are afraid of that. I have a strong suspicion that many of the crises of faith and doubt that we go through, that even some saints go through, like maybe Mother Teresa or Thérèse of Lisieux, whom we just celebrated, I suspect that at least some of those crises of faith are that we, with all good intentions, are holding on to a narrow vision or a little too rigid formulas that are not wrong, but they're not adequate anymore to the vastness of what we're experiencing. So it sounds like we're losing our faith when all we're doing is growing in it. I often say to people who come to me, I'm not sure of my faith anymore, and I say, congratulations. Not because you're losing your commitment, because you're deepening your commitment. You maintain and you build on the old formulas. They're not wrong, obviously, but they're not adequate anymore to the mystery. And we have to not be afraid of opening our hearts and minds to new ways of seeing, to new ways of formulating, to new ways of understanding this ultimately incomprehensible mystery of God, into which we've been plunged by the very gift of faith that we've received and by the very surrender that we've made. That's why it says in the gospel, the apostles say, and we should say, increase our faith. Make it grow. Or as the second reading says, fan into flame this faith that you've been given. So my belief is, my experience, both personal and pastoral, over the years, is that the primary, or one of the primary ways, the deluxe way, the privileged way of deepening your faith to follow its own inner dynamic is through contemplative prayer. To deepen your prayer life, leap into the silence, whatever method you want to use. There are lots of methods in our Christian tradition, lots of methods in the world that you can use to plunge into the mystery. And by the grace of God, you'll be led to the deeper understanding, deeper joy, deeper peace, deeper understanding, beyond understanding, to know the love of God which surpasses knowledge, as St. Paul says to the Ephesians, and to be filled with all the fullness of God, to know the length and breadth and height and depth, Ephesians 3, of the love of God, to be filled with all the fullness of God. Now, if you're filled with all the fullness of God, do you think little formulas are adequate to that? They can point to it, that's fine. But don't be afraid to lose your footing and plunge into the depths. That's why I often say, the real opposite of faith is not doubt. It's just those are growing pains most of the time. The real opposite of faith is fear. You won't let go. You won't answer that call of God to leap into the abyss of God. That's why, again, the second reading says, the Spirit we've received is a spirit of strength, not a spirit of fear. You shouldn't be afraid to make that leap. So, when Jesus says, if you had a grain of mustard seed faith, you could say to this tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea. Well, don't try it out on trees. Try it out on yourself. Uproot, and the roots are deep. Uproot your own egoism and fear and hesitation and selfishness and defensiveness and all the stuff that prevents your surrender to the infinite God. Let your faith follow its own inner dynamic and lead you to a fullness of life and joy and light and peace that you could never imagine. And that faith is what radiates into the world. A living faith that's your whole being of love and joy and compassion. That's what transforms the world as well as yourself. So take your faith out of its little box. Let it loose and see what it does to your life.